Number 4, roles and responsibilities. Starting out, this subject can get super complicated, as there can be several different people involved with a confined space. With that said, we're going to focus on the 3 most important players: the entrant, the attendant, and the supervisor. If more people are required, it's best to review your entry procedures and call your safety team for oversight and guidance. The entrant is simply the person that's going to be going inside of the confined space and performing whatever work is needed. It goes without saying, entrants have the highest risk, which makes sense because they're going to be exposed to the most hazards. That's why the following 5 responsibilities are so critical to know. The first is understanding hazards. This is going to require my entrants to spend quality time learning about the hazards that you could be faced with before you go into a confined space. Even so, you still need to be a part of the corrective action discussion. After all, these are going to be the countermeasures that protect you. The second one is just using your equipment the way that it's intended. Make sure to properly use any equipment that is required for safe entry and exit, personal protective equipment, atmospheric testing devices, and any communication equipment. So speaking of communication, this brings us to our third responsibility: communicate effectively. Before you go into a confined space, you should have discussed how are you going to communicate with your attendant and your supervisor. Maintaining communication with your attendant is going to be one of the most important things that you do. If something was to happen to an entrant, the attendant is going to be our first line to call for help. So make sure before you go into a confined space that the entrant, the attendant, and the supervisor are all on the same page with communication. The fourth responsibility is just going to be to self-monitor. Just be aware of your surroundings. Try to stay calm and tune out all of the noise. Focus on the task at hand, listen to your body, and trust your gut. If something feels weird or feels off, communicate that to your attendant and follow your evacuation procedures. And last but not least is evacuate. If your attendant or supervisor calls for an evacuation, you are to exit the space immediately. Overriding that evacuation call is not your decision to make. Just get out. Now let's talk about the authorized attendants. I want to start out by emphasizing how vital this role is. Being a good attendant is incredibly important. You alone are a vital element in ensuring a safe entry and exit of a confined space. That's because the following 6 responsibilities are pivotal to the operation. The first is continuous monitoring. This is where you're going to remain vigilant, both watching the inside of the confined space and monitoring the surroundings around the confined space. The second is communication. You need to be continuously communicating with your entrant. This could be done via radio, phone, short tugs on a line, or even verbal commands. However you and the entrant are going to communicate, this needs to be discussed before entry. The third is responding to emergencies. So in the event of an emergency, your role is going to be to communicate with the entrant and get them out of the confined space. The fourth is going to be preventing unauthorized access. The only person that's allowed in a permit required confined space is going to be the entrant on the permit. All others are going to be unauthorized. It's going to be your responsibility to make sure that those people stay away. The fifth is monitoring conditions. So just like earlier, we talked about being vigilant inside and outside the confined space. Make sure that good environmental conditions remain throughout the duration of a confined space permit. And last but not least is assisting in non-entry rescue. So what follows under this responsibility is calling for help, giving specific and detailed information about the exact location that you're at, and follow all directions given by the emergency personnel upon their arrival. So the next role that we're going to talk about is our entry supervisors. In a nutshell, this role is to ensure that all parties are on the same page. This means all steps have been followed, the permit has been filled out, and work is ready to begin. The entry supervisor role is the procedural stopgap where all parties are reminded to double check their work. Just remember, the entry supervisor is ultimately responsible if anything was to go wrong. So that's why you shouldn't forget these 6 responsibilities. Number 1, authorize and verify that entry conditions are safe before allowing any worker to enter a confined space. Number 2, review permits and confirm that all the required tests have been conducted and that all procedures and equipment specified by the permit is in place. Number 3, terminate entry and cancel the permit when the entry operation is complete. Then don't forget to verify that the surrounding space has been secured. Number 4, verify the safety procedures are in place for the entrance, such as the isolation of the confined space, atmospheric testing has been conducted, ventilation procedures, if needed, are followed to the manufacturer's specifications, and most importantly, the readiness of medical services if needed. Number 5, ensure that rescue and emergency services are not only available, but the means for summoning them is available. And number 6, evaluate, address, and ensure that appropriate actions have taken place to eliminate or at least mitigate any of the recognized hazards before entry is allowed. Chapter 5, Entry Permits and Procedures. There are several different ways to do an entry permit, and if you've been around for a while, you've probably seen them all. With that said, whether they're digital or they're paper, the information should be relatively the same. So let's go through each of the 9 components and briefly talk about the information required for each of these 9 components. Component 1, identification information. On whatever permit that you're using, there should be a mixture of these 3 questions: the permit number, the location of the confined space, and a brief description or overview of the workspace. Component 2, purpose of entry. In this section, this is where you start to get a little bit specific about the work that you're doing. So for under task description, ensure that you write down what is it exactly that you're doing inside of the confined space. And for authorized personnel, at a minimum, there should be an attendant, an entrant, and a supervisor. But this is the area where you list all names involved. Component 3 deals with hazard identification and control measures. This section is for the team to identify all of the potential hazards and then assign effective control measures to help mitigate those hazards. Component 4, atmospheric testing. Confined space entry requires atmospheric testing. This is the section where you're going to write down your results. So for any permit required confined space, don't forget to test the upper atmosphere, the middle atmosphere, and the bottom atmosphere of the confined space where workers are going to go. And as for continuous monitoring, this is the section where you describe how you're going to monitor during the entire entry. Component 5, safety equipment. What this section is for is explaining all of the personal protective equipment that's needed for a safe entry and exit of a confined space. I'll note as well, any of the PPE that is required for entry should be based on the pre-entry hazard assessment. Even so, don't forget to talk about what exactly you have on site for any rescue equipment. Component 6, communication and coordination. So essentially the communication plan is how is the entrant and the attendant going to maintain a level of communication throughout the entire duration of a confined space entry. Even so, if something does happen and help is needed, make sure that emergency contacts are filled out and the team members have been briefed on who to call. Component 7, entry and exit procedures. The entry procedures are essentially what are the procedures that we have to follow when entering a confined space. With that said, the exit procedures are what are the procedures that we have to do in order to exit the confined space. Component 8, authorization. This is where the entry supervisor comes into play. That's because the entry supervisor has to authorize that the permit is not only filled out, but it's accurate and complete. Authorization of a permit should always be made with the entry supervisor's signature. For entry duration, don't forget to specify how long the permit is valid for. If the time elapses and work still needs to be done, a new permit must be completed. Component 9, post-entry review. This is the section where the entire team's going to come together, review the entry process from beginning to end, notate any discrepancies, verify that the work has been completed, and that the space is safe to close. The very last step is canceling the permit, and this should only be done by the entry supervisor after work has been completed. What I find interesting is how each of these components work together to protect all parties involved through 4 essential functions. Number 1, ensure safety by verifying all safety measures and procedures are not only in place, but are effective before entry into a confined space. Number 2, controlling access to regulate and document all persons who enter and exit a confined space. Number 3, identify and communicate any potential hazards that are present in the confined space or have the potential to be in the confined space. And number 4, compliance. This is where we're going to make sure that we're following all appropriate standards, including all university guidelines.